The British Empire once ruled 1/4 of the earth. They called it civilization. They called it progress. But beneath the flags and the railways lies a darker truth. Massacres, famines, torture, genocide across 5 continents. Indigenous peoples paid the price. This is the story they tried to bury. And it will shock you. Blood on the red earth in Australia when the British arrived in Australia in 1788. Somewhere between 300,000 and 750,000 indigenous people lived across the continent. They belonged to hundreds of distinct nations. Each had its own language, laws, and territory. They had managed this land sustainably for over 60,000 years. The colonizers saw none of this. They saw empty land waiting to be claimed. They called it terra nullius, land belonging to no one. With those words, they erased 60,000 years of history and began one of the most complete dispossessions in human history. The first conflicts began almost immediately. Within months of the first fleet's arrival, tensions erupted around Sydney Cove. The Owara people watched strangers cut down their trees, kill their animals, and fence off their water sources. When they resisted, they were shot. This pattern spread across the continent as British settlement expanded. Settlers wanted land for sheep and cattle. Indigenous peoples stood in the way. The solution was brutally simple. Drive them out. Kill those who refused to leave. Colonial records document what followed. Massacres at dawn. Punitive expeditions against entire communities. Poisoned flour left at waterholes. Men hunted on horseback. Women shot while sleeping. At Myall Creek in 1838, settlers tied together 28 Aboriginal people, mostly women and children, marched them away from the station and hacked them to death with swords. 7 men were eventually hanged for the crime, one of the rare instances where settlers faced justice. Historians have now documented over 500 frontier massacres across Australia. The death toll runs into the tens of thousands, perhaps much higher. Many killings were never recorded. In Tasmania, the violence was even more concentrated. Before British colonization in 1803, an estimated 3,000 to 15,000 Aboriginal people lived on the island. Within 3 decades, they were nearly gone. In 1828, martial law was declared. Soldiers and settlers were authorized to shoot Aboriginal people on sight. Bounties were offered for capture. In 1830, the governor organized the Black Line. Over 2,000 armed settlers and soldiers formed a human chain across the island, attempting to drive all remaining Aboriginal people onto a single peninsula. The remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians, exhausted and starving, eventually surrendered. They were relocated to Flinders Island. Disease and despair killed most of them within years. By 1847, only 47 survived. Raphael Lemkin, the man who created the word genocide, looked at Tasmania and saw one of history's clearest examples. Those who survived the massacres found themselves strangers in their own land. Indigenous peoples were pushed onto reserves and missions. These were prisons without walls. Every aspect of life was controlled by white administrators. Indigenous workers received little or no pay. Their wages were held in government trust accounts. Decades later, investigations revealed much of this money had simply disappeared. Sacred sites were desecrated. Mining companies dug into places where ceremonies had been performed for thousands of years. Rock art that had survived for tens of thousands of years was dynamited to clear land for grazing. Indigenous Australians were not counted in the national census until 1971. They could not vote in federal elections until 1962. They were governed but had no voice in government. By 1900, the indigenous population had collapsed by 90%. Entire nations had been wiped out. Languages spoken for millennia fell silent forever. Today, Indigenous Australians remain the most disadvantaged population in the country. Lower life expectancy, higher rates of incarceration, ongoing struggles for land rights. The wounds have never fully healed, and across the Indian Ocean, another catastrophe was unfolding on an even larger scale. The stolen harvest in India before the British arrived. India was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. It produced nearly a quarter of the world's economic output. Its textiles were prized across Europe and Asia. Its farmers grew rice, wheat, and vegetables that fed hundreds of millions. 2 centuries of British rule changed everything. The East India Company came first as traders. They stayed as conquerors. By 1765, they had secured the right to collect taxes across Bengal, one of India's richest provinces. Within 5 years, famine struck. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed between 1 and 10 million people. 1/3 of the population perished. Villages were emptied. Fields lay abandoned. Bodies rotted in the streets of Calcutta. The East India Company did not lower taxes, it raised them. It continued exporting grain while people starved. Company profits actually increased during the famine year. This was the first of many. Over the next century and a half, famine swept through India again and again. In 1783, in 1837, in 1860, in 1876, in 1896, in 1899, each time, millions died. Each time, British policies made the catastrophe worse. The famines were not simply natural disasters. Monsoons failed in other centuries too. Indian rulers had developed systems to cope with drought. They stored grain, they reduced taxes, they organized relief. The British dismantled these systems. They restructured the entire economy to serve London's interests. Farmers who had grown food for their families were forced to grow cash crops for export: indigo, cotton, opium, jute. The crops left India on British ships. The profits filled British bank accounts. When drought came, there was nothing left to eat. During the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, between 5 and 10 million people died across southern and western India. The Viceroy, Lord Lytton, opposed relief efforts. He believed they would encourage laziness. He insisted that market forces must be allowed to work. While Indians starved, grain continued to be exported. Lytton hosted a lavish feast in Delhi to celebrate Queen Victoria becoming Empress of India. 60,000 guests attended while millions died. The final Great Famine came in 1943. Bengal again. World War II was raging. Japan had captured Burma, cutting off rice imports. The colonial government responded by seizing rice stocks and boats from Bengali villages. 3 million people died. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was asked repeatedly to send food aid. He refused. He blamed Indians for the famine, saying they bred like rabbits. When told of the death toll, he asked why Gandhi was still alive. Food continued to leave India throughout the famine. Ships carried grain to Europe, while Bengalis dropped dead in the streets of Calcutta. India recorded 31 major famines during 190 years of British rule. Compare that to 17 famines in the preceding 2,000 years. Close to 30 million people died during the Victorian era alone. Some estimates place the total death toll from British-era famines above 60 million. Economists have calculated the total wealth extracted from India during British rule. The figure is almost incomprehensible. $45 trillion in today's money, drained from a country that was left impoverished, divided, and scarred. When India finally gained independence in 1947, the famines stopped. Democratic government, however imperfect, created accountability that colonial rule never had. But the damage was done. A nation that once produced a quarter of global output was left among the poorest on earth. And the British had already moved on to other colonies, other methods, other horrors. In Africa, the brutality took different forms. Blood and chains in Africa. The British came to Africa for gold, for land, for labor. They stayed to build an empire that would reshape the continent forever. Before a single colony was established, British ships had already carried millions of Africans into slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was history's largest forced migration. Over 3 million Africans were transported to the Americas in British vessels alone. They were packed into ships like cargo, chained below decks for weeks, fed just enough to survive the crossing. Those who resisted were whipped, tortured, or thrown overboard. Those who survived faced lifetimes of brutal labor on plantations. They would never see their families again. The prophets built cities, Liverpool, Bristol, London, grand buildings and elegant townhouses financed by human misery. Banks and insurance companies that still exist today were founded on the trade in human beings. When Britain finally abolished slavery in 1834, Parliament compensated the slave owners. £20 million was paid out. The enslaved received nothing. That debt was not fully repaid until 2015. But the end of slavery did not mean the end of exploitation. The scramble for Africa began in the late 19th century. European powers carved up the continent, drawing borders with no regard for the peoples who lived there. The British claimed vast territories across East, West, and Southern Africa. In Kenya, white settlers seized the most fertile highlands. Kikuyu, Maasai, and other peoples who had farmed this land for centuries were pushed onto reserves. Their labor was still needed, but now they would work for wages on land that had once been theirs. In the 1950s, resistance emerged. The Kenya Land and Freedom Army rose up against colonial rule. The British called them Mo Mo and declared a state of emergency. What followed was systematic brutality. Over 1 million Kikuyu, Imbu, and Meru people were forced from their homes into fortified villages surrounded by barbed wire. Tens of thousands were sent to detention camps. Inside those camps, torture was routine. Detainees were beaten with clubs and rifle butts. They were subjected to electric shocks. Men were castrated. Women were sexually assaulted with bottles. Prisoners who refused to confess were executed in front of others. The British Attorney General, stationed in Kenya, wrote that conditions were distressingly reminiscent of Nazi Germany. When independence approached, colonial officials burned 3.5 tons of documents to hide the evidence. But survivors remembered. In 2013, the British government acknowledged the truth. Compensation was paid to over 5,000 survivors. The Kenya Human Rights Commission estimates that over 100,000 people were killed, tortured, or maimed. Similar patterns repeated across British Africa. In Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, indigenous peoples were pushed off their lands for white settlers. In South Africa, British policies laid the groundwork for apartheid. In Nigeria, colonial administrators played ethnic groups against each other, sowing divisions that would erupt in civil war after independence. The borders drawn by colonial powers split ethnic groups and forced rivals into the same territories. These arbitrary lines continue to fuel conflict today. When the British finally left Africa, they left behind economies designed to extract resources, not develop nations. They left education systems that taught African children to despise their own cultures. They left trauma that echoes through generations. The wealth flowed out, the damage remained. And across the Atlantic, in the Americas and Caribbean, the exploitation had begun centuries earlier. Blood and stolen lands in Americas and Caribbean long before the British Empire reached its height. Its foundations were being laid in blood across the Americas and Caribbean. The Caribbean islands were among Britain's most prized possessions. Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Antigua. These small islands generated enormous wealth. That wealth came from sugar, and sugar came from enslaved labor. By the 18th century, the Caribbean sugar plantations had become death factories. Enslaved Africans worked 18-hour days during harvest season. They fed cane into crushing mills that regularly claimed hands and arms. They boiled sugar in vats where a single slip meant being burned alive. The mortality rate was staggering. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and buy replacements than to keep them alive. On some islands, the enslaved population had to be entirely replaced every decade. The profits were extraordinary. Sugar made British merchants fabulously wealthy. It funded the Industrial Revolution. It built the grand country estates that still dot the English countryside. Jamaica alone generated more wealth for Britain than all 13 American colonies combined. But the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean had already been destroyed. The Taino, the Kalinago, and other peoples who had lived on these islands for thousands of years were wiped out within decades of European contact. Disease, enslavement, and outright slaughter reduced populations of hundreds of thousands to virtually nothing. The British then turned to Africa for labor, launching the transatlantic slave trade that would devastate that continent for centuries. In North America, the pattern of dispossession was equally devastating. British colonizers arrived on lands that had been home to indigenous peoples for over 15,000 years. The Powhatan, the Wampanoag, the Cherokee, the Iroquois Confederacy, hundreds of distinct nations with complex societies, governments, and cultures. The colonizers wanted land. They took it through treaties that were broken almost as soon as they were signed. They took it through wars of extermination. They took it through forced relocations that killed thousands. Indigenous peoples were pushed steadily westward. Those who resisted were massacred. Those who cooperated were betrayed. Sacred lands were seized. Hunting grounds were destroyed. Entire peoples were confined to reservations, dependent on government rations that often never arrived. In Canada, the British and later Canadian governments pursued policies of cultural destruction that continued into living memory. Residential schools operated from the 1880s until 1996. At least 150,000 Indigenous children passed through these institutions. They were forbidden from speaking their languages. They were beaten for practicing their traditions. Thousands died from disease, neglect, and abuse. The explicit goal was to kill the Indian in the child. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar revealed hundreds of potential burial sites at former schools across Canada. Children who had been sent away and never came home. Families who were never told what happened. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that the residential school system constituted cultural genocide. In 2022, Pope Francis traveled to Canada and acknowledged it was genocide without qualification. Across the Americas and Caribbean, the British Empire and its successor states systematically dispossessed, enslaved, and destroyed Indigenous peoples. They extracted wealth on an almost unimaginable scale. They left behind poverty, trauma, and broken communities. Today, Indigenous peoples across these regions continue to fight for recognition, for land rights, for justice. Many communities lack clean water, adequate housing, and basic services. The colonizers are gone. The consequences remain. And even in Europe itself, the empire's reach extended in ways often forgotten. When we think of British colonialism, we often look to distant continents. What they did there would become the template for empire. Practicing their religion openly was prohibited. Educating their children in Catholic schools was outlawed, and entire people were made foreigners in their own country. The Irish language was suppressed. Irish culture was denigrated. The Irish themselves were portrayed as lazy, violent, and incapable of governing themselves. But the greatest catastrophe came in the 1840s, the Great Famine. When a potato blight struck Ireland in 1845, it destroyed the crop that most Irish depended on for survival. The British response would define colonial cruelty for generations. Ireland was not short of food. Meat and dairy products from Irish ports to England. Armed guards escorted food convoys past starving people to ensure the exports continued. British officials believed that the market must not be interfered with. They feared that providing relief would make the Irish dependent. Some saw the famine as an opportunity to clear the land of surplus population. Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant in charge of famine relief, wrote that the famine was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. Over 1 million people died. Another million fled, beginning a wave of emigration that would reduce Ireland's population by half within decades. Those who left carried memories of coffin ships where thousands died at sea. They carried memories of watching family members starve. The population of Ireland has never recovered. Before the famine, approximately 8 million people lived on the island. The famine was not a natural disaster. It was a policy choice. Food was available. It was simply not given to those who needed it. The same logic would later be applied in India, where millions would die in famines while grain was exported. In 1997, British Prime Minister Tony Blair expressed regret for Britain's role in the famine. It was not a full apology. Many in Ireland believe one is still owed. The empire's first colony was also its longest suffering. And across all these continents, the shadow of empire remains. The shadow that remains. The British Empire no longer exists. The colonies are independent. The flags have changed. The maps have been redrawn, but the shadow remains. Across 5 continents, indigenous peoples continue to live with the consequences of colonization. The trauma did not end when the last governor sailed home. It echoes through generations, shaping lives that have never known colonial rule firsthand. In Australia, indigenous peoples have life expectancies years shorter than other Australians. They are incarcerated at the highest rates in the world. Many communities still lack basic services that others take for granted. The gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in health, education, and employment remains stubbornly wide. In India, the famines ended with independence, but the wealth that was extracted over 2 centuries never returned. A nation that once produced a quarter of global output was left impoverished. Its industries had been deliberately destroyed to benefit British manufacturers. In Africa, the borders drawn by colonial powers continue to fuel conflict. Economies remain oriented toward exporting raw materials rather than developing local industry. The infrastructure built by colonizers was designed to extract wealth, not serve local populations. In the Caribbean, the descendants of enslaved peoples continue to face the economic consequences of centuries of extraction. Calls for reparations have been met with silence or dismissal. The legacy of residential schools haunts families who are still searching for answers about relatives who never came home. In Ireland, the population has never recovered to pre-famine levels. The scars of partition and conflict are still visible in the divided streets of Belfast. For decades, this history was hidden. It was not taught in British schools. The empire was remembered fondly, if it was remembered at all. A time of global influence, of civilizing missions, of railways and legal systems generously shared. That narrative is finally cracking. Historians have uncovered evidence that was meant to stay buried. Survivors have told their stories to anyone who would listen. Lawyers have brought cases to court. Governments have been forced to acknowledge what was done. In 2013, Britain apologized to Kenya and paid compensation. In 2008, Australia apologized to Indigenous Australians. In 2022, Pope Francis called Canada's residential schools genocide. These apologies matter. They represent official recognition that terrible wrongs were committed, but they are not enough. The lands taken were never returned. The wealth drained was never repaid. The languages silenced and traditions destroyed cannot be restored with a speech in Parliament. Indigenous peoples are not waiting for permission to heal. Across the former empire, communities are reviving languages that were nearly lost. They are reclaiming traditions that colonizers tried to destroy. They are fighting for land rights, for recognition, for justice. They are still here, despite everything that was done to erase them. The policies were designed to eliminate Indigenous peoples entirely, through violence, through starvation, through assimilation, through the destruction of culture, and yet they survived. The sun has set on the British Empire, but for those who remember what it did, the work is not finished. Justice delayed is not justice delivered. This history belongs to all of us now. What we do with it is up to us.